سیاست در قبال ایران، ماشه و تحریم و ضرورت حسابرسی از رژیم.
اجلاس فوق‌العاده در 10,000 نقطه در دوسوی آتلانتیک در آستانه اجلاس مجمع عمومی سازمان ملل متحد.
سخنان و پیام رئیس جمهور برگزیده مقاومت خانم مریم رجوی به ملل متحد. 1. حقوق بشر برای مردم ایران. 2. تحریم همه جانبه دیکتاتوری دینی. 3. به رسمیت شناختن مقاومت مردم ایران و نبرد شورشگران برای آزادی.
سخنان اعضای برجسته سنای ایالات متحده: سناتور روبیو، سناتور بلاند، سناتور تد کروز، سناتور منندز، سناتور شاهین، سناتور پورتمن، سناتور مکسالی، سناتور جیلی براند، سناتور جانسون.
سخنان 22 تن نمایندگان ارشد کنگره آمریکا: کلینتاک، گوسار، شیلا جکسون لی، رائول روئیز، گودن، امر، جودی شكووسكي، کرنشا، دیوید جویس، رابرت آدرهولت، فرنچ تد براد شنایدر، بیکن، جودی گاس بیلیراکیس، مایکی شریل، راب بودال، لوری تراهان، کاتلین رایس و گلن گروتمن.
سخنان رودی جولیانی، جوزف لیبرمن، نیوت گینگریچ، ژنرال جیمز جونز، ژنرال جکسون، رابرت جوزف و سناتور آیات.
جولیو ترزی، وزیر خارجه ایتالیا، 2011-2013.
نخست وزیر و وزرای پیشین آلبانی پاندلی مایکو، فاطمیر مدیو و کلایدا جوشا.
دیوید جونز و باب بلکمن، نمایندگان پارلمان انگلستان.
Bad news. It's about nuclear ambitions. It's about the sponsorship of terrorism. It's about a regime that executes people. I think lost in all this conversation is that there's a huge gap and an enormous difference between the people who govern Iran, the clerics who govern the country, and the millions of people who live there. Iran, the nation, the people, is home to an ancient culture which has contributed to mankind in extraordinary ways in the arts, in literature, in the sciences. That's what the nature of the Iranian people are, rooted deeply in their culture, who seek not simply to dominate the region, but destroy nations that are in their way. So one of the things that I'm so glad that all of you do, and one of the things I hope we'll continue to do, is make very clear that our quarrel is not with the people of Iran or with their incredible civilization. Our quarrel is with the men who govern that country that have turned it into something completely different from what it has always been and what it has always been meant to be and what it can be again. Now it's governed by a radical clerical regime who wants not simply to continue to sponsor terrorism, but to continue to terrorize their neighbors. So this battle, your battle, our battle, is not simply to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, not simply to keep Iran from continuing to sponsor terrorism. This is all very important. The real battle is to give Iran back to the Iranian people so they can reclaim the greatness of an extraordinary civilization and once again be the home of a peaceful country in which people from all different backgrounds live together and contribute to the world once again. So thank you for everything you're all doing to highlight this, to work on this, and know we will be with you every single step of the way.
It's great to join you as we talk about more freedom and more tolerance in Iran. The Iranian regime remains the leading state sponsor of terrorism, continues to defy warnings from the international community to abandon its nuclear program, and blatantly violates its treaty obligations, not to mention its blatant disregard for human rights. And they continue to violate international restrictions by advancing their ballistic missile program. Iran's a force for destruction and destabilization in the Middle East and around the world. The Iranian regime funds and provides weapons to the Shia militias in Iraq, provides arms and military forces to the brutal Assad regime in Syria, supports Hezbollah terrorists in Lebanon, and provides advanced weapons to Houthi rebels in Yemen. Hundreds of U.S. military personnel in Iraq were either killed or injured by IED sponsored by Iranian forces. And by the way, at this moment, Iran is trying their best to interfere in America's election process with putting false information out there on way more than a daily basis, purporting to come from other sources, but we know where it's coming from, and we're going to do what we need to stop that. As the coronavirus began to spread around the world, the Iranian regime neglected the well-being of its own people. It suppressed information about the outbreak. Iran's leaders have refused offers that our country, the United States, has given of assistance to combat the virus, and they've revoked approval of support teams for international medical humanitarian organizations. It really seems that there's no limit that they won't go to harm the citizens of Iran. The Iranian people deserve better care and protection from their government. And they should be permitted to benefit from humanitarian assistance that's already exempt from sanctions. One obstacle to a better life for the Iranian people was the removal of Soleimani when he was killed earlier this year. A failing regime in Iran has done everything it can to make that former commander of the Quds Force a martyr. But we all understand the cause of terrorism was his singular goal. He was a bad person. He spent his career far outside the boundaries of any civilized nation and what that nation would consider acceptable behavior. He pretended to be a high-ranking military official, but really was a terrorist in a uniform. Now, thankfully, that evil person, the determined enemy of freedom and democracy in the United States, was eliminated, and frankly, that elimination allows us some breathing room as they try to reconsolidate and to determine who's going to get the power that Soleimani had taken for himself. Despite the hopes that the previous administration had for moderation, Iran has just simply increased its destructive activities after the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The JCPOA did not work. Strengthening sanctions on Iran is an appropriate response to Iran's continued aggression. The Iranian sanction regime is the best tool we have to hold Iran accountable, and one we really need to continue to keep. We hate the impact. I think it's clear that their activity of this government, the behavior of the Iranian government, hasn't changed much in the last couple of years after the nuclear agreement. I've long stood with you in your fight to ensure that we determined to never forget the residents of Camp Ashraf, or forget our commitment to the people who were there. We worked really hard jointly, you and I working together with many of my colleagues and many of my former colleagues to see that we kept our word. I was able to visit so many of you in Albania just a couple of years ago. I was also able to lead meetings of a congressional delegation on that same trip with Albanian leaders. I've had Albanian leaders since that trip, including the president, in my office in Washington to talk about the needs that need to be respected and the needs that need to be understood of people in Albania. Now, another thing this really does, frankly, it allows more time to be focused on Iran than the time we were focusing on getting people to safety out of Camp Ashraf. But it also is important to look at the great accomplishments that they have made in the building and the vitalization of their new location in Albania. There are many incredible achievements that have been made throughout the years opposing the regime. We have to continue to focus on eliminating imminent peril while losing sight of what's happening in Iran and to the Iranian people. Our concern can't just be being sure they don't attack us or attack our friends outside of Iran. We need to be concerned about the daily attacks on the people of Iran, who through their uprisings, their protests and strikes have been seeking regime change. And we really see an escalation of those protests in the last 2 years. People carry on that fight. Many of you either are involved in the fight directly or involved in doing what you can to encourage the fight from other places. And no matter how brutal the regime gets, no matter how much physical or psychological torture, no matter how harsh the sentence, how many political prisoners are executed, activists and journalists abused in every single daily activity, but you continue to lead in that fight. We have to listen to the message of the Iranian people as they chant down the dictators. Iranians deserve a secular government that respects the rule of law, freedom of speech, and ethnic and religious differences. The United States stands with the Iranian people who are putting their lives and their safety on the line every day to pursue that kind of future. I'm pleased to stand with you to resist the oppressive Iranian regime in the cause of freedom, and pleased to join you at this important event today.
Hello, and thank you all for attending this important summit. I'm honored to be able to speak to you today and hope that these discussions are informative and constructive. As I've long maintained, and as we've spoken about together before, it is an absolute necessity that we hold the officials of the Iranian regime accountable for their torture, their human rights abuses, and their crimes against humanity. Recently, we were reminded that there is no outrage the regime will not commit, no matter how loud the international community objects, when they tortured a confession out of Naveed Afkari, and in recent days, murdered him. We must hold the regime accountable and their enablers accountable for this crime. The Islamic Republic of Iran's abysmal human rights record is inextricably tied to its nuclear ambitions. I've been proud to lead the fight in the Senate against the catastrophic Obama-Biden-Iran nuclear deal from the time it was very first negotiated. Since the United States rightly withdrew from the deal, I've continued to fight, pushing for an end to the oil waivers successfully, as well as an end to the civil nuclear waivers. I'm thankful that the Trump administration has rightly invoked the snapback mechanism, which is a final step to terminate this disastrous deal. Iran's tyrannical and evil regime continues to finance and export terror, endangering the lives of Americans and the national security of both us and our allies. By using our existing authority to invoke the snapback sanctions mechanism, we have taken a necessary step to counter Iran's aggression, to deny the regime resources, and to slow significantly the development and deployment of Iran's nuclear program. If we did not invoke these sanctions, the UN's arms embargo would expire and allow China to start selling billions of dollars of weapons to the Ayatollah. Iran has consistently been in violation of nuclear restrictions before, during, and after the negotiation of the deal. And the Ayatollah is right now systematically advancing towards a nuclear weapon. Much more, of course, remains to be done. And I remain committed, as I know you are, to ensuring that this Iranian regime is ultimately brought down. I wish you the very best as you conduct your summit. Thank you, and God bless you.
Hello everyone, I'm glad to be joining with you once again to stand with the Iranian people as they continue to fight for their fundamental human rights and hold the Iranian regime accountable for its ongoing human rights abuses and its support for terrorism. As I said earlier this year, I'm pleased to see that you're joined today by many of your compatriots in Albania. Your safety and security prove that dedicated advocacy and fighting for your cause can improve your situation, and hope that all Iranian people may someday be able to live in safety, dignity, and freedom. Unfortunately, the Iranian regime continues to give us reason to doubt that future and to show the world that it has no intention of changing its oppressive and reprehensible behavior. Over the weekend, despite local and international appeals, the Iranian regime hanged wrestling champion Navid Afkari. His crime was participating in a protest against the regime. With no evidence and a forced confession, the regime convicted him for killing an undercover agent. We know the real reason they wanted him silenced. He was a strong voice for the voiceless against an oppressive regime and for justice for his fellow compatriots. Over the past year, we've seen Iran prove again on the world stage that it is not interested in making peace with its neighbors or respecting Iranian human rights. Beyond its abuses of people at home, the regime continues to support terrorism and the brutal regime of Bashar al-Assad and continues on its path towards nuclear weapons. While in Congress we may have differing approaches about the best way to address the threat from Iran, rest assured that we remain united against the regime's fundamental abuses against its citizens, oppressing and denying fundamental rights to women, jailing peaceful activists, threatening journalists. Moreover, we stand united in our efforts to prevent Iran from continuing to export its ideology in the form of terrorist actors and destabilizing activities. And we are united in preventing Iran from being able to threaten her neighbors and the world with a nuclear weapon. We must engage in diplomatic efforts in concert with our like-minded partners and in concert with people who appreciate and value the role of human rights and democratic values. Thank you again for the work you're doing on behalf of the Iranian people.
Hello, I'm Senator Jean Shaheen. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. This is an important summit that comes at a critical time for Iran and the global community. The government in Tehran continues to commit gross human rights violations against both its own people and in the conflicts that it supports across the region. Iranian support for terrorist organizations and like-minded oppressive regimes has destabilized countries and prevented peace across the region. At home, the regime denies its people the right to freedom of assembly, expression, and association. Peaceful activism is met with harsh jail time. Human rights advocates are arrested and tortured. Unfortunately, these authoritarian tactics were on display at the end of last year when hundreds of thousands of Iranians came out into the streets to demand change and a just government that does not stifle their freedoms and opportunities. But instead of listening to the Iranian people, the government responded to these protests with armed force. That's why I'm an original co-sponsor of legislation that expresses support for the rights of the people of Iran to determine their own future and condemns the Iranian regime for its crackdown against legitimate protests. The United States must stand up for human rights everywhere and condemn injustice anywhere. To this end, we support the people of Iran as they fight for human rights and freedoms. Thank you to everyone who is here virtually today for all of your hard work. I look forward to continuing the fight with you.
Hi, I'm U.S. Senator Rob Portman. Thanks to the Iranian-American community of Ohio for inviting me to speak to you about the importance of promoting a free, democratic government in Iran, one that supports the people and their aspirations to have a better life for themselves and their families. Our conflict is not with the people of Iran, but rather with the fundamentalist regime that currently oppresses them. We must continue to show strength in the face of the regime's attempts at undermining the international rule of law and spreading international terrorism as well. I have supported this administration's stance against the Iranian government and will continue to advocate for a tough policy that prevents them from acquiring nuclear weapons and exporting chaos throughout the region. The people of Iran deserve better than a government that spends its scarce resources on proxy forces and terrorism instead of domestic priorities. The recent execution of the wrestler Navid Afkar on manufactured charges is just one more example of a corrupt regime that does not care for the basic human rights of its people. Let me be clear. Our argument is not with the Iranian people, who have been so poorly served by their own repressive government for more than 4 decades now. I'm heartened that groups such as yours, comprised of freedom-loving Iranian Americans, continue to stand in opposition to the barbarism of the mullahs, and to show the world that the Iranian people desire freedom most of all. Thank you for your important work on this issue. Godspeed.
Hi, I'm Senator Martha McSally. Thank you to the Iranian American community of Arizona and the members of the Organization of Iranian American Communities for inviting me to speak at this summit to support a free Iran. I'm inspired by the Iranian people who continue to put their lives on the line to protest the murderous Iranian regime. America stands with the protesters, demanding their God-given rights for freedom. I served 26 years in the military and deployed to the Middle East and Afghanistan 6 times, flying the mighty A-10 Warthog. I've seen firsthand the terror the Iranian regime has inflicted on so many innocent people. I fully support President Trump's maximum pressure campaign against Iran, using all elements of national power, economic, diplomatic, informational, and military deterrence. And I'm grateful that the President had the resolve to order the killing of terrorist leader General Qasem Soleimani, who is responsible for the deaths of countless Americans and Iranians. I've joined other senators to co-sponsor many bills this year alone, that will help hold Iran responsible for their malevolent actions. The U.S. and the international community must continue to hold Iran accountable for its human rights violations and reprehensible behavior. We must endeavor to end their dangerous proliferation of nuclear weapons, terrorism, and the repression of their own citizens. Our world cannot be stable while the #1 sponsor of terror continues to operate. Thank you for your work to promote a free and democratic Iran. America stands with you in fighting for a better future for the Iranian people.
مذهبی و قومی در ایران پیشرفت کند قدر می‌شناسیم. قدردانی من متعلق به همه شما برای ثبات قدم و تعهدپذیریتان و برای کارهای مهمی است که انجام می‌دهید. لطفاً بهترین آرزوهای من را برای یک گردهمایی پرنشاط و قدرتمند بپذیرید.
سناتور ران جانسون رئیس کمیته امنیت داخلی و امور دولتی در سنای آمریکا طی پیامی خطاب به کنفرانس حمایت از ایران آزاد، ضرورت تحریم و حسابرسی از رژیم ایران تاکید کرد. ده‌ها سال است که رژیم ایران به سرکوب مخالفان و سرکوب تظاهر کنندگان پرداخته و نوید افکاری جدیدترین قربانی وحشیگری رژیم حاکم بر ایران است. سناتور جانسون افزود: ایالات متحده آمریکا اعدام نوید را محکوم می کند و به ایستادن در کنار مردم ایران ادامه می دهد.
condemns his execution and continues to stand with the people of Iran.